Welcome to Sollu Kaburz podcast. After a long time, my apologies for this massive gap. As you know, I live in India and we've been through a massive, deadly second wave, and I was not in the right mental space to do a podcast or talk about anything else. That's how the time was. And now we are back. The episodes will be rolling on this podcast. So I welcome you all once again. And today's topic is the news that was raging a few days back, and it's gotten quiet now. But I think it's not only important to have a conversation on issues like this, not only when there is some incident happening but also post incident, because you have to keep the question alive, you have to keep the conversation alive about what is happening. And today the topic of conversation, of course, is the Israel Palestine conflict, or in my words, Israeli aggression on Palestine. And no words will be minced on this podcast. And I am being joined by two wonderful Palestinians, Rawan Nemir and Fathi Nemir. Welcome to the podcast. It's an absolute pleasure having you all the way from Ramallah, if I'm not wrong.
Yes, we are in
So,
Ramallah right
I am a massive fan of your website on Twitter. That is how I bumped into you on the social media. Website is decolonizepalestine.com, and it is an absolute goldmine of history and information and debunking the myths and the Western perspective that we get around the world on this conflict. You try to pull that back to a different perspective, which actually it should be deserved to be educated among the public. So I am a massive fan. I mean, I've gone through your website, much more helpful than Wikipedia for a start. and
yeah,
and Wikipedia, you know how it is, forces can edit that, but I love the fact that you have started being too independent. You're not some journalist. I'm not sure about your background, so can you please tell us about how you come up with this website and who you are and why you felt this was really important and how hard you worked to put that up?
yeah, of course. So it was Fathi's idea originally to have a YouTube series where like debunking these common, Zionist Israeli state talking points, propaganda points, myths. Both of us come from this background of like obviously being Palestinian from when we were born, realizing that there was this aggression against us, realizing that there was oppression, there was something wrong, and doing activism in different ways, going on social media and talking about Palestine in different ways. So from the point that we met, it sort of developed from there, us talking about what we felt were the most common questions we would get as Palestinians. Not necessarily from Zionists, right? Like from people who don't really know much, who just occasionally see it on the news and who either get, these kind of wrong ideas or just have like an incomplete idea in general. So we just started talking about what role we wanted to play in correcting these misconceptions.
yeah, we'd see the same kind of. We try to debunk all of these misconceptions and myths that we'd see, but at a certain point, we'd be repeating ourselves. We felt like we were, the same broken record. So we thought, why not just kind of centralize all this information in a place which it would be accessible for everybody in a language that's accessible, and at the same time it would be an introduction, but at the same time it would also be like a gateway for you to more deeply educate yourselves. That's why we focus a lot on books and journal articles, and we have further readings and a reading list and such, because I mean no website can be comprehensive 100%, but at the very least we can like offer a baseline for information, and people can then go and further educate themselves if they're interested in it.
What I absolutely love about your website is everything that you claim, which sounds like outlandish, you drop a link for reference so that people can immediately fact checked. And
Yeah, for sure, because there's everything has been so incredibly ingrained. Like so many myths have been ingrained. Like if you
mm,
hear the mainstream narrative about, for example, the 1948 war, you'd think that uh, a giant army descended on Israel, when in fact the Israeli army at the time, it wasn't Israel yet, but the Yishuv army was outnumbered all of the armies combined, and they
mm.
had superior weaponry and they had superior organization. So they try to frame it as this, David versus Goliath, but the opposite is that, they were actually the Goliath in this situation. And I
Mhm.
think a lot of people find this outlandish, but when you actually go through the numbers and the data, and from different sources, British, Israeli, and the Palestinian, like you find that no, actually all the numbers, the problem isn't that who outnumbered who, The question becomes, to what extent did the Israelis outnumber the rest?
Mhm.
So it really flips a lot of talking points on their head. And they can sound outlandish if you've been listening to mainstream media for the last 50, 60 years. It's going to sound completely outlandish. This is why we thought it was really important to have everything be documented and with passages from which books to, double check it if you don't believe us.
And I think to add, we as Palestinians, we can't afford to mince words, or we can't afford to be completely not 100% correct on every single claim that we make. Unlike Zionists, unlike even, the very top levels of the Israeli government, like the idea of Twitter tweeting out a video from Syria or a video from Pakistan and saying that, oh, this is what's happening in Gaza. Like, they don't even have to be accurate in these videos. And this is, again, like the official state media, where Palestinians, every single claim that we make, we have to have like 50 different sources from, different points of views, lest we be accused of being just biased, of um, being dehumanized as, oh, this is just like a Muslim point of view, or this is a Muslim this, or a terrorist that. It's we have to be so careful with everything we say.
Yeah, and this is a function of Orientalism. Yeah, it's we're never believed. We're not allowed to say our own stories. Like, they want us to refer to other people to tell our own story for us, because we can't possibly be neutral, objective about what's going on. And this even shows when I was, for once, this is a story I like to repeat a lot. Once I was quoting a passage from a Jewish Israeli Zionist book.
Mhm.
The author identified himself as so very obviously, and the first response was that, oh, your Arab book is full of lies. Like, that's the knee-jerk reaction to any claim a Palestinian makes. It's either a lie, it's a fake, it's misrepresenting something somehow. So we really need to have 10 different sources backing us up at all times, and this is never expected of our of people arguing against us. You have people who are just like a random person who happens to be Jewish, who grew up in New York. He thinks that he can argue equally to somebody who studied Palestine, lived in Palestine their entire lives, just because they happen to be Jewish, for example. I mean, this is the logic of ethno-nationalism.
Mhm.
So this is one of the challenges we faced, and why we wanted the website to be as detailed as possible, with all the links and quotations being sourced, because otherwise it's just going to be, empty claims, and we want it to be actually academically valid.
Coming to the aggression that happened very recently, and first of all, massive condolences to you in case you've suffered from the recent bombings, and massive condolences to entire Palestinian community out there. And I was really, I mean, the entire thing is enraging, but there was one particular video that really, made, how to put it bluntly, made my blood boil, in that sense that there was this video where a bunch of guys from Israeli were dancing behind a wall when something was burning on the other side of the wall. I don't know if you remember that video that really went viral. I saw that video and I was like, you know what? A few decades ago, these guys were on the other side and they were Nazis dancing on this side of the wall. And why? Why? I mean, how did they become this? And that was such a horrible video. But like, how are you now? How is the community coping now? Is the life getting back? I mean, life has never been normal there, but is it getting back to some sort of the previous sense, or how's the community coping up right now?
Well, the thing
Well,
about the sorry, you go ahead.
no, go ahead, Fatih.
Okay. The thing about, being under occupation and settler colonialism is that there's no really normal. There has been a ceasefire, which means Israelis are not going to be harmed anymore, which means that the media doesn't give a shit. Doesn't care anymore. So, like, this is our reality. Every single day there are houses that they're demolished, where hundreds upon hundreds of Palestinians are being arrested, especially inside 1948 Palestine. uh, People are still being shot. Like yesterday, a university student, Fadi Washa, Allah yarhamu, was martyred while he was at a demonstration. He was shot by Israeli forces. uh, like, this is our daily life that nobody seems to care about, unless Israel is somehow inconvenienced. If there was a settler who was running and tripped and twisted their ankle, that be in the news about, oh, the cycle of violence begins, though. But Palestinian occupation, I mean, occupation and settler colonialism, by its very definition, is murderous. By its very definition, is violent. This is our reality every single day. every day we live under a physical military occupation. Like, it's not hyperbole or an exaggeration, but some people have normalized this to the point where they don't even see it as constituting violence anymore. They see it as the natural order of things, and this is what we're trying to break. Obviously, we're trying to break out of that and tell them, hey, there's a ceasefire, but we're still being ethnically cleansed. I mean, Sheikh Jarrah, which began this whole issue, the families that were about to be ethnically cleansed, the court only mandated a kind of postponement for the decision. They didn't cancel the decision. So that's still going on, which was basically the trigger for everything that happened with Gaza. And people just seem to decontextualize everything and take everything out of context and make things seem like little separate escalations. And this is all on purpose. This is all done so that everything seems to be, like little contained escalations that, oh, you just sold them and everything goes back to normal. No, there's no normal for us. We're every single day we're living under oppression and different kinds of, matrix of domination and apartheid and what have you. And we need to break out of this, and we need to shake the world almost, to like, wake up, look what's happening. It's not over just because Israelis aren't inconvenienced anymore.
Yes, and to add context about the specific video that you are referencing, it was a tree that was burning in Al Aqsa Mosque, and these sort of like extremist settlers. I mean, all settlers are complicit, but these are particularly, racist, particularly antagonistic towards Palestinians. They were cheering because a good deal of them believe that they don't want Al Aqsa Mosque to even be there in the first place. They believe that it should be destroyed and that in its place should be built like the rebuilding of the Temple Mount. It's just a very extremist sort of religious slash ethno-nationalist, merging of sentiments. And these were the same who every year this group of Israeli settlers, they go marching through Jerusalem. They call it Jerusalem Day, the day that they took over Jerusalem, and they say, death to Arabs, may your village burn. These kind of very common chants. I mean, Fathi always mentions this too, but even in their football games, they'll say like death to Arabs. Like, what do we even have to do? It's just that's how ingrained it is to their nationalism, to their understanding of their place in this land, to their understanding of what they want. And it says something to reference also what you were saying about how once, many of them are descendants of Jewish people who were persecuted, whether by pogroms, whether by the Holocaust. It it really is awful because we have seen multiple times, for example, members of like the Likud party, more of these far right Zionist parties, say something like Gaza deserves Shoah, or making these genocidal sentiments. There's many books and articles that are more eloquently going into what I am referencing, but there is this idea in Zionism that we have to be murderous, we have to show strength because we were weak before and now we cannot be weak again. And Palestinians pay the price for this kind of response, for this idea of what it means to have been a victim of atrocities, and to decide that in order to not be a victim of atrocities, you have to be okay with committing atrocities against another people.
Fathi was pointing at one fact that life is not normal, in the sense, to give a context, like the very simple example of when I live in a particular city and I want to go to another city to attend someone's birthday. I don't have to take someone's permission to go somewhere, right? And I don't have to
Mhm.
take permission to study somewhere else. I'm working at some other place than my parents are working, and I absolutely do not have to worry what is happening to my parents in the other city, right? This is such basic common things that people live in, reasonably peaceful countries around the world. But even this normal life is not what your life is on a daily basis, not in times of war and conflict and all. This is your daily life, isn't it? There are many such examples, isn't it, Fatih, that people just have it granted, like lying at their feet, which you don't even have access to.
Yeah. They're I think people don't understand the totality of control of our
Mm,
lives. They don't understand how complete it is. In every single aspect of your life, you can't even look like, if you're a Palestinian and you try to marry someone who's non-Palestinian, you're not allowed to, because that would be a preventable increase in Palestinian population. Because, surprise, the civilian registry is de facto in the hands of Israel. They control the civilian registry, so they even get to decide who is a Palestinian and who isn't. Like even very, very silly, inconsequential things
Hmm.
like having 3G for your mobile. The infrastructure was there 15 years ago, or not, sorry, not 15 years ago, 10 years ago. But Israel simply would not allow us to turn it on because, quote unquote, security reasons. And that's what they always keep talking about, whatever. I mean, it's been turned on in the last couple of years, but it's just a very silly, tiny example just to show how from the biggest issue of your nationality to
Hmm.
the silliest issue of how you access the internet, everything is regulated by Israel. You can't go to another city because there's a checkpoint in the way, and if they decide that your ID says the wrong thing, then you're not going somewhere. Remember, during the second intifada, my ID card said Jenin, which is the city that I originally come from, but I was living in Ramallah. They said, well, your ID says Jenin, why are you in Ramallah? So they're not gonna allow me to leave the city. So I wasn't able to go on a trip with my friends at that day. And that's, again, a very, very silly thing. It's not a very serious thing to say, oh, I can't go on trip with my friend. But this animates the logic of everything. If you want to go for treatment, like today, Israel, since the ceasefire, I remind you, not a single rocket has been fired since then. Not 90% of all permits for people from Gaza to go get treatment for cancer have been denied by Israel, and they won't even allow Gaza to have treatment facilities for cancer because every few years the hospitals get bombed. There's no infrastructure. There are no chemicals allowed in, except with very controlled amounts. So they're not allowed to treat our own people, and we're also not allowed to go get treatment elsewhere. And it's just if they're not trying to actively kill us, they're not doing anything to stop us from dying naturally or any other way. I mean, it's the logic of settler colonialism.
Sure.
And it's full of examples like this. There's nothing you can't do which doesn't somehow in some way tie back to Israeli approval or disapproval of you.
Just making life as unbearable as possible throughout. I mean, Fathi is, I think, minimizing the trip, about how unfair it is to be told you can't go on this trip, and I know he's doing that because he knows, we both know people who have been murdered, children who have been murdered, people who have been like permanently disabled, people who are dealing with really, really tough circumstances. But that really is part of the bigger picture, in that like they're trying to make life as like difficult and unbearable as possible, as even if you're doing something like quote unquote apolitical, that you're just trying to like live your life. If you wanted to go to the beach, if you wanted to do all these kind of like normal things, you can't do it. And honestly, I think what frustrates me is because, spending most of my life in the US, I know for a fact that most Americans wouldn't handle these kind of inconveniences. You know what I mean? Like, or these Europeans, like they ask why Palestinians resist or why Palestinians push back against these things when they couldn't, like they wouldn't even be able to handle like a long wait at the DMV, let alone like a soldier in your face with his gun telling you that you, a child, cannot go on this trip, or you cannot pass through this checkpoint, or you can't do these other things. So it's like they can't even begin to wrap their heads around the sort of daily humiliations and the
Hmm.
daily, repression. But then they're confused about why there are Palestinians who would resist.
Do you think in the recent bombings, do you feel any difference in the way the world has reacted compared to the previous conflicts? Did you see anything different? What did you make of the reactions around the world? I mean, there were support marches and support rallies in London and Australia, I believe, in US as well. People from even from Jewish communities have come out in support. So, is there anything different? Did you feel heard this time, a little more heard than you were previously, or it makes no difference? What did you make of it?
I personally, I do think it is a difference. I mean, the size of these protests have increased in terms of more Jewish people coming out against Zionism. I know we've been fortunate all our lives to have met anti-Zionist Jews. It's not something that has been unheard of for sure. But I think I can see that it's been increased. We're very, intent on saying that the ceasefire doesn't mean that the occupation stopped or that these other violations have stopped. This other reality that we've been referencing, but it is. And even internally, we feel Palestinians have been more united. The fact that we were able to do a general strike when Palestine hasn't done a general strike since what, 1936, like this was a historic event. The fact that Palestinians were able to come together and say like, we are Palestinian and we are, standing for the end of this oppression,
Hmm.
um It is significant. It did feel very encouraging, and I think after, I'm sure Fathi will have something to add, but I definitely, after Fathi's response, would love to hear what you think about the response in India, because we've definitely been looking into that. We feel that, for example, a few decades back, there used to be more Indian support for Palestinians. It used to be, seeing us as an anti-colonial cause, the same way that Indians, um, opposed the very brutal British
Yep.
colonialism, and now there's been this reverse where, I think, unfortunately, and again you can add on this, most Indians were more likely to have favorable views of Israelis or of Israel than of Palestinians,
Yeah.
and so would definitely love to hear if you've seen a change on your end, after, if Fatih wants to add some comments.
Sure.
Yeah, I think that's a great question actually about India. But yeah, we do feel a slight shift, especially on social media.
Mm.
I feel like people are fed up. They're not taking all the excuses anymore. They're trying like it. And I think it's really tells the story when you have hundreds of thousands on the streets of London for Palestine, and the
Sure.
counter protest was barely 150 people
Mhm.
from what I understand. It's like the popular support for Palestine has always been there. The issue is that when it comes to governments, because
Mm.
governments are animated by interests and Western governments, imperialism, and all that, they don't really care that much about their own what their own people think. I mean, just look at the United States that do the opposite of what their people want sometimes, well, very often. Um, so we see a lot of popular movement for Palestine. The idea of boycotting Israel is becoming so mainstream now that to talk
Mm.
about it, like it used to be taboo to even mention this, even just 20 years ago,
Mm.
before the launch of the official BDS movement. It's there is a shift. There's a shift in public opinion. People are not taking any of the usual talk of the world community that's been going on for the last God knows how long, almost 30 years now, about, oh, we should practice restraint and hope for the two-state solution. No, nobody thinks any of that is realistic anymore. They all know that this is just to placate Palestinians,
Mm.
the world, while nothing actually changes, nothing happens, and Israel keeps building more settlements, it keeps annexing more houses, keeps ethnically cleansing more Palestinians out of their homes. uh, so people are fed up. They want to see change. They really do want to see change. And I think also Netanyahu's uh how buddy he was with Trump,
Mm.
really, and how Trump
Mhm.
was like one of the only countries in the world to have a positive view of Trump as president was Israel, one of the very few countries.
Yep.
uh, it really went in. I think it nailed the idea that this is a very right wing society, very
Mm.
open to fascist ideas, very right wing on the side of every strongman leader like Orban and all these other quote unquote strongman leaders, right wing, basically fascists, that
Mhm.
are cropping up all over. There was a resurgence, Yani, of this kind of right wing fascism in the last couple of decades, and it really undermines their argument that any criticism of Israel is anti-Semitic when they
Mm.
are arming, selling weapons to outright neo-Nazi groups in Ukraine and being allies with Orban, one of the most anti-Semitic leaders in Europe, and such. But as I said, it all goes about interests and has nothing to do with actual morals or fighting anti-Semitism or what have you. It's just about how they can cynically weaponize all of these things for state interests, and that's always how it has been. I mean, it's easy to say things about, oh, we want peace, but I mean, Europe is especially guilty of that. Europe always
Mm.
talks about human rights and peace and what have you, but when you look at their votes at the UN, they always either abstain or vote against any way to investigate Israel for any of its crimes or
Crimes.
something like that. But they would never object to that in other contexts. Again, it's all about, like, they don't care if they about if some other country that they're not have very strong ties with goes to the ICC or what have you. But when it comes to Israel, suddenly, you know, it's nuanced, it's more complicated, it's so complex. Oh, we can't just it's really complicated, and they can't come up with an opinion on it. Where very clearly in another context they can, and that's people are sick of that. And I think we're hearing, at least online, people are very much turning against that recently.
And the hypocrisy of American, I'll come to the point of India, Ravan, in a bit, but the hypocrisy of American support to Israel, right? I mean, they themselves have massive anti-Semitic communities. I mean, what are Trump voters basically, right? There's just nothing but pure anti-Semitism in there. And when they support Israel, it the hypocrisy has like no limits. The thing about India is, I'm just going to sum it up in just one sentence. It's just that India has become Islamophobic. It's all it is. It has become Islamophobic. And you know, the strongman friendships around the world, it's not really out of the book to see Netanyahu and, you know, Modi holding hand in hands. And the funny thing is, I mean, you shared me one podcast on email, right? So the funny thing
Yes.
was, here's how racist Zionist Israelis are, right? So the Indian right wingers were posting something in the support of Zionist Israeli right wingers that we are with you and we have solidarity, and the Zionists are hitting them back like, you Indians, you cow dung eaters, we don't want your support here, you know, which is really funny. Which
Yeah.
is pretty freaking ironic, you know what I mean? It was really funny to watch, but we are very much on the path of. I think Israel is like far more brainwashed than Indian right wing is, but we are there. We're on our way, I guess.
It really is unfortunate. We keep going back to, again, India has this history of anti-colonialism, of fighting against their own oppression,
Mm,
and for it just shows how poisonous ethno-nationalism is. Because like I don't think it is too far off to say. And once I remember the title of this book, I will for sure send it. It was comparing Hindutva and Zionism. And I don't think it is far to say that there's these connections in this way, the same way that, Jewish people, like the Jewish people who chose Zionism instead of like combating anti-Semitism, instead of joining with the
mm,
other non-Jewish people in their society, going down this path. It just shows what almost the inevitable result of that is when you start saying that we have rights because of our ethnicity, and people who are not of this ethnicity are either like worse or less than or just not deserving of the same rights. Then
mm.
this is the sort of dark path that it takes you down. It takes you down this path of enthusiastically cheering on violence and
Yep,
cheering on the murder of children, so long as those children are not members of your ethnic.
yep, exactly. And also, how disappointing was? I mean, it is an expected response, but how disappointing was US's response? Like, you knew Trump would obviously, you know, support something like this, but it also shows that Democrats are no different when it comes to their indifference towards the Palestinian cause, right? Joe Biden basically is selling more weapons in a few days, I guess. US presidents are basically funding war crimes and they're not being called out because they're the big daddy.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, Democrats have always had this relationship with Israel. There's really very little difference materially when you look at how Republicans and Democrats deal with Israel.
Yeah.
I mean, Obama was framed as the most anti-Israel president in history by his critics, and yeah, I think it was like $38 billion of weapons deals that he approved,
Yeah.
and all of these things. And it's funny because the only thing that Obama really did was he talked a bit.
Mm,
He said that, oh, you shouldn't expand settlements, and one UN vote instead of using the veto, he abstained, and that was like unprecedented in the
mm,
face of all this stuff. So they think that this, not even voting for but abstaining from voting and not using a veto, that was enough to paint him as the most anti-Israel president in history, which is ridiculous on every single point you try to actually look at. It's not
mm,
only hyperbole, it's almost hysterical to the point that it's completely fabricated outrage that somebody didn't was 99% with them instead of 100%,
mm,
and they framed this as some kind of bias against Israel, and it's ridiculous. It shows how used to getting their way, like
mm,
the pro-Israel forces in Washington, and
mm,
that doesn't mean like I remind you that most Zionists in the world today are Christian Zionists, not Jewish
Mm-hmm.
Zionists,
mm.
and the strongest pro-Israel lobby in the US is actually evangelical Christians. So
Yeah.
I say this when I say like it's not some kind of hidden conspiracy of world control. No, I'm talking about actual lobbying forces with actual organizations.
Mm,
They're so used to having their way. They're so used to being able to dictate what goes on when it comes to how the US treats Israel and treats Palestine. And this is just a continuation because, again, what can the Palestinians offer to somebody like Donald Trump or somebody like Joe Biden? We really can't offer anything. But when you come to like a giant voting demographic, tens in the millions, uh, Biden is going to pay attention to that. Trump is going to pay attention to that. And obviously, when it comes to lobbying, Palestinians don't have any lobbying power. So, like, why would they even look at Palestinians? Obviously, he's going to try and differentiate himself from Trump through the use of rhetoric, through saying, "Oh, Palestinians also deserve to not, to not be murdered every day." And I mean, that's fantastic. But what are you going to do about it? And they never really do anything about it. They just give a little bit more aid to the Palestinian Authority, which most of it, by the way, is spent on security forces, which coordinate with Israel to repress Palestinians. So, and most of it finds its way back into Israeli coffers anyway, because everything you have to import has to go through Israel and you have to pay tax on that. So, really, it's all just one big scam. And American support for Israel is unquestioned. I'm talking on the government level, at least, because on the popular level, we're starting to see some shifts that weren't there something like 10 to 20 years ago. But again, like most of the population in the US is for some kind of, healthcare, and that hasn't swayed really anybody at the top, because again, the lobbying groups have the actual power and not the
People.
not the people.
The
So
capitalist.
yeah, yeah, it's capitalism. It's how that's why I don't think there can be an actual democracy under capitalism if we're talking about it like in the true sense. But that's a
Yeah.
that's a whole other can of worms.
Yeah. Is that all it takes to stop Israeli war crimes? Like just somehow disconnect US from Israel? Is that some US president somewhere in the future who just says enough is enough? Is that all it takes, or is it much more complicated than that? Is US the only thorn in the path of achieving some sort of independence for Palestinians from the Israeli oppression? Because it kind of seems like the funding and the support that they get from US is the backbone of this, and on top of which they have built it on their own. So what will it take to cut that relationship, in a sense, like a different president, or what should happen in your fantasy, if you may?
I just it will be difficult to get the US to stop supporting it. So many things would have to change, but
Mm,
we couldn't we can't undermine or we can't underestimate the effect of the billions of aid
mm,
that goes to Israel from the US. Like this is huge to propping up Israel's economy, Israel's everything. And keeping their military with all the weaponry that they have, and making it so that they can actually spend money on their citizens in terms of like healthcare and things that like even Americans do not get. It would be difficult than just one president, like even if by some miracle
mm,
a pro-Palestinian president was elected, you still have to deal with Congress, you still have to deal with the Senate, you still have to deal with all these companies in the US which run the show of like, no, like we love the gravy train that is this weapons trade,
mm,
and not just weapons but even like surveillance technology, yeah, or these other things. And I think also just the reason why the US is going to be supportive of Israel, among the other reasons, is they're not going to come out against settler colonialism when the only reason the US exists is because of settler colonialism, because of what they did to the Native Americans. It would just be awkward at the very least for them to be like, oh no, we can't be getting rid of the natives. Like you're still treating the natives that were not, murdered horribly on these
yeah.
reservations. The Navajo Nation in COVID-19, when they requested support for the pandemic, they were sent body bags. Like this is still ongoing to this day. The same, the US is not going to come out and say, why are the Australians treating the Aboriginals this way either? So it's just we see this as all the interconnected struggle against settler colonialism, period.
Mm,
But in the meantime, this is why the S in BDS is like sanctions. If we could get that kind of pressure on the US, if
mm,
we could at least curb some of these weapon sales, as like these brave activists are doing today, taking over the Elbit manufacturing weapon system. That's in the UK, but in the US, activists going and trying to block these ships that are carrying cargo from Israel from docking, these kind of things. Like this it chips away at this support, and I think that is part of what will make our liberation possible.
yeah. And it is also supporting a state that is not exactly democratic and secular, right? I mean, there are Palestinians who live in Israel, and Israel is basically a white supremacist, racist country, right? It is not even treating its own black Jews properly, for example,
Mhm.
right? It's not exactly treating Palestinians who live in Israel, properly, right? It's basically, as long as you're white, you're good in that country. It's not exactly this fair country that people really think of Israel as, this progressive, fair country. It's filled with classic right wing, Islamophobic, racist hate. Is that a fair thing to say?
Oh, for sure. I mean, the war on terror, I would just come out and say that is one of the best things that happened to Israel because they got to just coast on that wave of like, oh, look, see, we're dealing with terrorists too. Like that's why we need this weaponry. That's why we need this. That's why everyone needs to support us. And like, all the Palestinians who are against us are Muslim terrorists,
Mm.
and relying on this kind of dehumanization, ignoring the fact also that of course not all Palestinians are even Muslim. Um, and I think Fathi will have something to say about this too because it frustrates us both equally. But they've started this talking point of like, oh, over 50% of Israelis are not white. How can you say that Israel is a white supremacist state? And it's okay. First of all, like even a black Ethiopian, Jewish settler, they have privileges that Palestinians do not. They have the state is still seen as for them to a lesser extent than Ashkenazis for sure. There's very deep anti-black racism. People have been talking, of course, about how Ethiopian Jewish citizens were sterilized without their consent, where all these horrible things happened to them. And even if you look at the first Zionist propaganda, the ideal Jewish man was depicted as like blonde hair with blue eyes. Like this is not something new. Even I know Fathi for sure will have something to say about this as well. About what about the not white Israelis?
Yeah. I think that there's people who don't understand really how settler colonialism works. I mean, like, no matter what kind of Israeli you are, you're living at my expense, and this needs to be expanded. We're not talking about individualistic politics. Yeah, and you could be the most, dovish, peace, quote unquote, wanting Israeli, but you'd still be living in like an ethnically cleansed town, like, and your town is still built on the ruins of my people. It's not about that individual things, and that we need to avoid the shallow reductiveness that's been plaguing some various interpretations of identity politics that's been used. It's like, oh, like the picture of Ahid Tamimi, which she
Mhm.
had basically a checkpoint right next to her house ever since she was a child, and she is of the Tamimi family, who are known to be light skinned and have blue eyes. And when she was arrested, the picture of her in court was next to an Ethiopian Jewish soldier. So Israelis were like, "Oh, who? Look at the white supremacy here. It's low. How can Israel be white supremacy when a black soldier is arresting a light-skinned child?" Of course, that she's a child never comes into effect. That's just a Palestinian. Actually, to the point where they said that she's an actress because there could be no light-skinned Palestinians. Just the whole logic of white supremacy permeates through Israeli society. And when it comes to democracy, I don't think it's fair to call Israel a democracy at all. I mean, even Israeli academics are arguing this point. Oren Yiftachel classifies Israel as an ethnocracy,
Mm.
which is much more accurate. An ethnocracy is a state that's built for the supremacy of one ethnic group over the rest, and it has a nominal democratic window dressing, basically elections, but the core of the state, yeah, and you cannot challenge the supremacy of one certain group over the others. And within this ethnocracy, there are also tiers and castes.
Mm.
And this is obviously reflected in the founders of the Israeli state. Almost, I think, 99% of all the original founders of Israel are actually Ashkenazi Jews from Eastern Europe. It's like the whole idea, and I remind you that also the Zionism as a political movement began from Europe,
Mm.
and it was based on European ideas of blood and soil and ethnic nationalism that was foreign to the Middle East at the time. We had no idea what was going on while people were plotting in the late 1800s about how to whisk away the penniless population and build a state and get rid of the natives.
Mm.
And like to the point where they were even talking about us like they were talking about black people in Africa and saying that, oh, there are a few 100,000 n-words and there's no worth of these people. That's how people were talking about us. Well, we had no idea what was going on at the time. This was in the early 1900s. So the logic of settler colonialism and white supremacy are tied together. Really, you
Mm.
can't untie them, because this whole idea of blood and soil and ethnic nationalism is a European a birth of European thought. And that's what they brought with them from the beginning. I mean, they were very obvious and very frank about it being a colonial movement. Their
Yep.
organizations, like they had a colonial trust, they had a colonization department. They were not shy about this. They thought that if they had this, they'd be closer to their European counterparts, which had been persecuting for all of history. So they thought, well,
Yep.
if we could become our own might, our own force, then we wouldn't be persecuted. But at the same time, that meant that they had to persecute other peoples in the process. And I remind you, this is still like 50, 60 years before the Holocaust.
Mm.
Obviously, there's a long thousands of histories of Jewish persecution in the world. But to frame is the creation of Israel as a reaction to the Holocaust is also not completely true, because England was actually very interested in having a state
Mm. Middle East.
close to Egypt
Yeah.
to secure its roots to India. It all comes back, it all
Yeah.
comes back to international interests and how they would maintain their empire. Like one of the main pieces is, other than uh, the second coming of Christ, which they believe will happen once Israel is established. And then obviously evangelical Christians think this way. If Israel is
Mm.
strong and it's established, then Jesus Christ comes back, the second coming, and they don't really actually care about Israel is what happens then, because I mean
Mm.
they'll be forced to convert or die according to their narrative. So I mean, this is an anti-Semitic support for Israel is like
Mm.
very, very normal and very natural, and was one of the earliest forms of support for Israel in the West.
Sure.
So this whole kind of logic is what animates. Like there's no way that people are actually convinced that a state like France or a state like England, or sorry, the United Kingdom at the time, who was committing genocide all over the world. Algeria was being butchered. The English were butchering all over the world people. That they somehow had an awakening of conscience and said, like, you know what? No, let's give a homeland for these poor Jewish people because we persecuted them. There's no such. This is naive thinking at best, or willful ignorance at worst. It's not. It doesn't make sense. Colonial powers don't do anything because of human rights or
Mm.
altruistic reasons. There's always an interest behind it. And the
Yeah.
establishment of Israel as an outpost for world imperialism at the time was that, because they're getting something out of it, not because they actually care about anyone.
Even today, that is the case with US, right? It's like it may have air bases in Saudi Arabia, but it ultimately needs one non-Arab state in the Middle East to keep a militaristic extension of itself out there in the
Yeah,
Middle
yeah.
East.
The thing about that is that Iran used to be a very big U.S. base
Yeah.
in the Middle East. Iran
Mm.
was the best buddies with both Israel and the U.S., but
Mm.
Iran had a corrupt ruling regime, and once they were removed, the people were overwhelmingly pro-Palestine and anti-Israel. So that completely shifted it. So
Mm.
suddenly Americans were not, welcomed there. The American interests were not being carried out in Tehran.
Mm.
So, but with Israel, because the whole population is basically imported. There's very, very few Israelis that can actually trace themselves to be living in Palestine, pre-mandate Palestine.
Mm.
Very, very few. Like the Israeli population is mostly a settler imported population. Even the ones from the Middle East, they're not from Palestine,
Mm.
So, but with Israel, there's no fear of that, because you have a population that's also pro-U.S. and pro, all of these policies. But with a place like the Emirates or Saudi Arabia or Qatar, one day there could be a popular movement and it could challenge the existence of these bases and could challenge support for the U.S. But with Israel, there's no challenge in that way. They're not afraid of that. So that's why Israel continues to play a very important role as an outpost for Western imperialism in the region.
And that's where they derive the courage to get away with basically war crimes. Every day we think of the ceasefire as some peaceful settlements, peaceful solution, but I'm pretty sure there is a lot of police brutality out there, lots of people just going missing, people just getting shot for no reason. Please tell us about the ceasefire, which is not exactly a ceasefire, because it's not exactly an end of oppression, it's basically a pause, isn't it?
It's well, Palestinians have continued to get shot, like in the West Bank, even in the 48 territories, what's now known as Israel.
Mm.
We see that multiple Palestinians have been killed and their murderers set free, and their funerals even cracked down on by the police. Um, a house was I keep mentioning this, but a house was firebombed in Yafa, and a 12-year-old Palestinian boy was very severely burned. And what happens to his perpetrators? Nothing. And it's the same thing in the West Bank. I know my coworkers' grandchildren came in and they were crying because it turns out that the recent funeral procession, I don't know if the pictures have been circulating that much, but the recent funeral procession for the martyr who had Birzeit University made a statement about him because he was a student there. He was the brother of their music teacher. They loved him very much, and now he's gone. So you see how even Palestinian children have, they from very young they come to this reality of like people who are close to you might be taken from you at any time
Mm.
for no reason. And Defense for Children International had done a video series on Palestinian children. One of them, they did a series on him, how he would go to the store to buy some fruit and he would get arrested and beat and blindfolded and detained from when he was like 13, 12, um, for no reason, or putting both his hands in the same sort of handcuff, all these different things, just violently repressing him, arresting him multiple times, throwing him in prison multiple times. And all he wanted to do was be a chef, and now he was killed. He was killed in these quote unquote clashes.
Mm.
And it's just, again, these stories over and over, it becomes really really heavy to take in. But yeah, I know we reference this too, but this is to them this is a ceasefire though, because as long
Yeah.
as for example, I don't know if you saw this Australian interview, but this woman came on and she was asking the Palestinian on the panel. She said, "My son lives in sorry, he lives in the area near Gaza, and his dog was really scared." You know, like that, as long as an Israeli's dog isn't scared, we can ignore the fact that there are Palestinians who are being murdered, and we can forget all these other awful crimes. Fathi mentioned this about the amount of people in Gaza who can't leave for medical treatment. But you know, the only coronavirus testing lab in Gaza was
Mm.
destroyed
Yep.
in these airstrikes. The head of the coronavirus task force was killed. And so, as you're saying, people are thinking as long as there aren't physically bombs dropping, that we're not feeling the reverberations, and we definitely still are. There are still Palestinians in Gaza who are dying as a direct effect of these airstrikes. And the multiple stories of Palestinians who lost family in 2014, losing them again this year.
Mm.
It's yes, so this basically sums it up, is we hope people don't take their eyes off of us for too long, and
Sure.
who can sit and say like, okay, no, what is happening is unacceptable.
In this case, what are the challenges ahead for Palestinian cause, right? Like, are you missing a leader like Yasser Arafat, for example? Obviously, you have to rebuild as a society after all the atrocities that have happened. So, apart from that, like politically, what challenges do you see further ahead? Do you feel that there's something different to look forward to this time, or what do you think of the future ahead?
One of the biggest accomplishments of the Israeli occupation of all different kinds of parts of Palestine is that in some way they thought they succeeded in shattering the Palestinian people into different parts. You have people in the West Bank, you have people in the Gaza Strip, you have people in East Jerusalem, you have people in the diaspora, and you have people inside of quote unquote Israel 1948. But this is starting to crumble because Israel has been terrible to all Palestinians in all of these different areas. And we've always we've always obviously felt like we were one nation and we were fighting for liberation together. But in this final escalation, in the most recent escalation, also our actions were coordinated. There were, like Rawan said earlier, there were strikes inside of every single territory, which was unprecedented for a long time. Uh, so overcoming this fragmentation is a key for our resistance, and is key for our future resistance efforts, because at the end of the day, the both populations between Palestinians and Jewish Israelis, we're almost at parity. We're almost, actually, the Palestinians are a little bit more now. uh, if we simply refuse to cooperate, if we simply refuse to accept and go on, it's going to be very hard for Israel to keep control, especially inside 48, which they were real heroes this last few weeks. They have been really amazingly resilient and amazingly disruptive of the Israeli state in many, many different ways. And obviously, we will need to keep our resistance up in any means possible. We have an international right to resistance by any means until we're free of occupation. It doesn't matter what kind of resistance we use. All of it is legitimate, in my view.
Mhm.
So we
In
need
terms
to,
of,
yeah.
oh, sorry.
So we need to keep focusing on this unity. I mean, the last events that were happening, some people are calling it the unity intifada, because this is how significant this whole actions have been, and it's really given us hope. It's really given us a lot to work with and a lot of things to think about. Like, they feel hopeful for the first time in a long time. I mean, even things like boycotting Israeli products is at an all-time high inside Palestine right now. There's lots of things going on that are really pushing, and we feel that there's some hope that we're actually not going to remain like this for another 500 years or what have you. I mean, Palestine is not alien to the idea of foreign conquerors. We had so many people here, so many conquerors. Like the Crusader states lasted for so long, for example. But they all had in common is that they thought they'll be here forever, and they're gone, but we're still here. And the same is going to be for Israel. It also thinks it's going to be here forever, but it's not going to be here forever.
Yeah, I love that. It's so wonderful. The hope. I guess just in terms of challenges, I'm not trying to take it back to a depressing place, but it's we have our work cut out for us for sure. It's not going to be easy. Um, their repression has only gotten more brutal, their weaponry more, intense, all these different things. But like as Fatah is saying, we do believe that we will prevail in the end. In the meantime, as in what you're talking about leadership, we there's a lot of Palestinians don't have really hope in some of the organized, official leadership as of now. So I think there's going to be some pushback against that. We need, like, the Palestinian Authority actively works and coordinates with Israel, and most Palestinians, like, we don't see this as acceptable, and so that has to be reckoned with.
What do you see hopeful in that case? What gives you hope after all that you've been through recently? What gives you hope that things will get better, if not immediately, but somewhere down the line?
Honestly, that's just most of what
Yeah.
Fathi said about, like, the unity, about feeling like there's coordinated actions, and just in general feeling that, I don't know, as Palestinians, we believe that Palestine will one day be free. We believe our cause is just. We believe that oppression cannot last forever. But it feels, for the first time in my life, and I think Fathi agrees with this, that we're going to see a free Palestine in our lifetime. I wasn't really sure of that. I knew it would be free, but I didn't think I could stick around to see it. But now what we've seen Palestinians talking about, for example, I keep bringing up this Twitter thread, but I loved it so much. It was in Arabic, but he's like, oh, here's a tip to Palestinian refugees when you come back, when you can finally, are given your right of return. Start talking about, like, oh, this area is really nice to live in. This one isn't. But just like even though it's, like, obviously theoretical, people are starting to actually talk about what I will do when Palestine is free. How my grandmother maybe died before she could come back to her village she was ethnically cleansed from, but I'm going to come back instead of her. I'm going to be able to actually walk in and not have, go to Ben Gurion Airport. It won't be called Ben Gurion Airport. You go to the airport and you're not shoved into the quote unquote Arab corner where they shove everybody with a Muslim or Arabic name and they interrogate them. No, I'm going to come in freely as if this is my country. This is so, honestly, for me, it gives me so much hope. It gives me so much motivation and encouragement.
Excellent. One last thing, Fateh and Rawan, can you tell us more about your website, where we can find your website, where we can find you on social media, and tell us about what you're going to do on the website in terms of furthering your message?
You can find us on decolonize.com, decolonizepalestine.com, decolonize with a Z, so it's the American spelling. Some Brits are going to be angry, but this project has been really in the works for the last couple of years. We have social media accounts that aren't as active, but we're going to get on them to get more active. Decolonize PS at Twitter. And Decolonize Palestine on Instagram as well, where we're starting to post infographics as well. We've never been huge Instagram people, but we're starting to learn, and it can actually be a very, very good platform. As for future developments, we're going to be releasing it in multiple languages. Hopefully, once we feel that the website is good enough to stand on its own, we're going to start translating it. We are thinking into Arabic, into Spanish, and possibly Hebrew. Yes, possibly Hebrew.
Hebrew, big time. Yes.
Yeah,
and so to go, like, a quick overview of the site is there's a section on myths, which
Mm.
is the sort of common Zionist talking points of like Palestinians use human shields, for example, or Palestinian identity is fake, it was invented recently, or just these other sort of nonsense talking points, or like 1948 wasn't ethnic cleansing, it was just a war and there was just these results of war. So each article takes this talking point and it breaks it down, historically into the present day. There is a section on washing, rainbow washing, which is, some examples: purple washing, blue washing, green washing. What these mean: greenwashing, for example, is when Israel presents itself as an environmentalist cause, or as
Mm.
being good for the environment, and
Which
like,
is
oh, look at all these amazing startups and the green technology. No, like, we break it down about how it's actually been very destructive to the environment, as settler colonialism, I think, ultimately is, because it prioritizes resource extraction for a certain group of people. And so it breaks that down. Purple washing, this idea that Israel's feminist, that Palestinians are treat their women terribly in comparison to Israelis, and this is why Israel's such a good thing. Like, basically, the washing,
yeah.
the logic of the washing article is that Israel's so great, it deserves to be here. Please don't look at what Israel is doing to the Palestinians, because like, look at all this like benefits that they're giving to the world.
Mm.
So that's what that is. The reading list, I think, is really great. It just gives all these like sort of vetted books for people to delve more into Palestine. And the 101 section is, I think, so crucial as well, because it goes into the different historical periods. It
Mm.
gives people the historical background that I think will help them understand the myths more, even, and leading up into the BDS movement and what
Yeah.
it is. In the future, we see, maybe having a spotlight section, something where we could talk about, different issues.
Mm.
Um, we have maybe like a tracker of different war crimes that happened from villages in 1948 to the present day. Just we have so many ideas bouncing around our head that
Sure.
this website will forever be a work in progress, for sure.
Yeah, we even want to add, like, at a certain point when we feel like we've added. I mean, we were always adding new myths and
Mm.
new questions to the FAQ and such. Like, those are without the
This is the
question,
FAQ,
obviously.
of course.
But we also want to add a culture section in the future where things are not so grim. We want to talk
Yep.
about, like, maybe the origins of Palestinian cuisine,
Mm.
or this is Rawan's jam, obviously,
Yeah, I do love
and
my
for
food,
jams
right?
too. Probably we have a great selection of jams. Um, we
Please
want
send us
to
some
talk
our way.
about. Yeah, I would if we had a postal service.
Yes.
Oh yeah, that's another thing that Israel controls. We can't even send any like, we have to send it through special, very expensive courier, or try to somehow sneak it through the Israeli post, but that's
Oh
not
my
very
God.
easy. Yeah.
Once occasionally they dump these big sacks of letters on people, and they're like, here's your mail, and it will literally, without exaggeration, be mail from 9 years ago or 10 years ago. Like, okay, thanks.
Yeah, there's no,
Yeah.
if they don't like, for example, I shipped my computer from Germany. That's where I studied, back to the West Bank in Palestine,
Mm.
and somebody wrote "Free Palestine" on the box, and they held it in security check for like 5 months because somebody wrote "Free Palestine" on it. I don't know who wrote it. It was probably somebody at the DHL company. I mean, I understand your support, but you really screwed me over there for a while. Uh, but yeah, like, again, every aspect of life, literally, like, you can't think of anything that's not controlled by Israel over here. I mean, that's what,
I
settler
will add
colonialism.
really quickly about the
Yes.
food thing. Obviously, our culture section would go into more deeply on this, but we do have a myth about the idea that hummus or falafel, these things are like Israeli dishes.
Mm.
So that's a myth people should check out, because that's definitely part of their efforts. It's part of their diplomacy efforts, so that people, when they think of Israel, they want them to think of like hummus and food and stuff, and not war crimes.
Mm.
But that's
Yeah, yeah.
historically, like, around the world, it's not been going that well.
Yeah, so, but a lot of things that we also want to develop, like, there's a huge database that I want to build for the Palestinian villages that were destroyed in 1948.
Mm.
And we're talking about almost 600 communities. So we want it to be sort of like kind of interactive map where you can click on the region and it shows up all these different villages with information about them, and each one takes you to a different article about it. But obviously this all needs, programmers, it needs
Yes.
artists, this needs people to work. And I mean, so far this whole website has been self-funded. It's just from me and Rawan. Like, nobody helped us outside of our friend Lara Isfahan Shiha, who donated the website
Mm.
hosting company. Um, it's a self-funded thing, and I think our art was especially one of the most
Sure.
taxing pieces because I mean, we're really proud of how the art came out. I think it really looks very uh,
It looked really good.
wonderful.
Yeah,
Yes. So like everything we need to do going forward is going to need some kind of professional that's outside of our, uh, expertise. So that's, I guess that's why we started our Patreon, so we can help continue and fund the website. And we've been surprised about the positive, how many people are actually interested in seeing the website continue to develop.
that's amazing.
So yeah, it really has been amazing. I mean, we've barely been out for a month and we're close to 1 million visits already, and that's like for a brand new website. That's very, very rare from what
Pretty
I
incredible.
understand.
Pretty
Yeah.
humbling.
I may be the millionth one. Who knows? But
Yeah, who knows?
it's been such a great chat, and it's obviously a subject that you can go on and on forever. But Rawan and Fatih, more power to you, more power to your message, more power to your cause, more power to your website. Hope it gets a million more and a million more in Patreon as well. Hope you get to do what you want on the website. Sounds like a great idea. I don't know how many libraries that you have, but this is going to be a very important library what you're building right here in your website, and it's very helpful to look back where you came from and preserve your roots in that sense. Thank you very much for your time. Hope we bump into each other somewhere down the line. It's been a great chat.
We can visit India one day.
And when you visit India, bring those jams and bring those
The foods,
all the good
yes, of
all the good
course.
stuff. We love our food. We love your food as well. We will
Oh,
love
we
your
love
food.
your
We
food.
love Indian food, yes.
Oh my God, yes.
Hopefully, we can exchange on one table. On that note, ladies and gents, that's it from this podcast. Till we see you next time with another episode. Bye, everyone.